Hello, this is Tony Anderson, and in this short video, I will highlight a few of the main ideas from Chapter 1 in your textbook. Before we continue, I want to be sure that you have first taken the hindsight bias self-assessment on Canvas. You might have heard the expression that hindsight is 20/20. Hindsight bias is our tendency to say, oh, of course, I knew that all along after we learn something. There are a number of misconceptions about group communication, so the hindsight bias self-assessment addresses some of those. If you have already started reading your textbook before taking this assessment, that's okay. It just means that you'll probably do better on the assessment than you otherwise would have. Your performance on the assessment does not hurt your grade, but you do get a complete grade just for doing it, which means you'll get a score of 100 regardless of how many questions you get correct. Let's jump right into this week's lecture content. First, we must define communication. What is communication? Communication scholars have many definitions for what communication is, but our textbook defines communication this way. Communication is a transactional process of sharing meaning with others. So what exactly does that mean, that communication is transactional? It means that as we communicate, we influence each other. To explain this, I need to give you a little context. What I'm about to share is foundational information for any communication course. So if you have taken other communication courses before, or if you're currently enrolled in another communication course, particularly one that I am teaching, this should reinforce what you've already learned. If you are currently enrolled right now, for example, in my interpersonal communication course, which is CALM 111, you will definitely feel a little deja vu. But please bear with me, because at the end of this foundational and historical information about the study of human communication, I will show you how all of this applies to group communication, which is the focus of this class. Historically, there have been two different models that communication scholars have used to study the process of human communication. The first and oldest model is the linear model. This model was first used to study media communication in the early part of the 20th century after the advent of radio broadcasting. It was assumed that human communication occurred much like the one-way broadcasting that happens when you tune into a radio station. Using that radio analogy is an easy way to understand this linear model. If you think of how a radio operates, you have a sender, or the radio station, and a receiver, which is your individual radio. The sender transmits its broadcasting signal or message, which your radio receiver then picks up. So using this model to describe human communication, a person talking might be thought of as a sender, and a person listening might be the receiver. The sender transmits their message using their voice and the air. We call this the channel of communication. So using the radio analogy again, you have probably tuned into a radio station in your car, and you got static or noise. In human communication, noise can also happen, but in this case, it can be physical, such as sounds in the same room as the two people communicating, or it can be psychological, such as the receiver is distracted by their own thoughts. Perhaps they are stressed about a big test they have to take tomorrow, for example, or they are nervous about something else. Noise can also be physiological, meaning the human body is somehow preventing us from concentrating on the message being sent. Perhaps we are hungry, or we're tired, or not feeling well. All of these things can interfere with our ability to receive another person's message. The transactional model is the more recent way we examine human communication. It is called transactional because communication is thought of as a transaction, or the giving and receiving of something. In this model, we have two communicators as opposed to a sender and a receiver, because both are thought to send and receive messages at the same time. As we speak to someone, we are watching for their cues to tell us that they understand, agree, or disagree. We can see this through their facial expressions, other body language, such as them leaning forward toward us or leaning away from us, or their eye contact. We call this nonverbal communication. We might also hear verbal utterances, such as uh-huh, yeah, mm-hmm. They may even interrupt our speech with their own speech. In this model, we still have messages. There are multiple messages now being sent simultaneously by both communicators. It isn't just one way as it was in the linear communication model. And we still have channels here, and we also still have noise. Another difference, though, between this model and the linear model is that each communicator inhabits an environment. This is the communicator's headspace and includes things like their background, their previous understanding of the concept that's being discussed, and so forth. No two communicators are identical, so our environments are unique to us. What you see happening in the middle of this model is the compounded noise that occurs when these two environments overlap. This makes it that much more difficult for us to interpret messages being received in the same way that the other person has intended them. So with respect to communication in groups, you can imagine how this compounded noise explains why so many people exhibit something we call group hate, which refers to many people's negative perception of working in groups. In terms of a transaction, individuals affect the group, and the group in turn influences each individual. In every communication instance, whether that is in a group or interpersonally among a couple of people, there are two dimensions of the transaction. The first is the content or the message that we are exchanging. The second is the relational component, which is the way in which our message contributes to the definition and redefinition of the relationship among the people in the communication transaction. As you might imagine, this can all get quite complex. In your book on page 10, there is a rather humorous yet realistic scenario of a number of students who are trying to meet to work on a group project. At the end of the scenario, no one is satisfied, and a couple of group members have become visibly disgruntled or even agitated. When you read Chapter 1, take a moment to think about that scenario after you read it. Do you identify with one of the members over others? Even if you don't identify with the person who seems to be a troublemaker in the group, which I think is David, we should always consider that each person has their own backstory about which we have little knowledge or understanding. We could ask ourselves, for example, what David might have going on in his personal life that is causing him to respond the way that he does. Perhaps on an individual basis, a group member could reach out to David to find out if there's something they can do to help or to persuade him to get on board with what the group wants to accomplish. What would you do in that situation if you were one of those group members? We obviously want to communicate effectively. And by that, I mean we want our message to get across as we intended it. But we also want to communicate appropriately. You communicate differently with your grandmother than you do with your boss at work, as one example, or differently with your siblings than you do with your teachers at school, or differently with your spouse or significant other than you do with your coworkers. You adapt your communication style when you are with each of these individuals. At this point, we should probably define a group. To qualify as a group, a collection of people must meet each of these criteria. It must be composed of 3 or more individuals. They must interact for the achievement of some common goal or goals. And they must influence and be influenced by each other. If we have a collection of people who do not meet those 3 criteria, we call that an aggregation. They can be near one another and they can even be interacting, but they are not considered a group. An example of this is passengers waiting at the airport to board a plane. So how about this? What about a collection of shoppers at a mall, such as this one in London? Is this a group? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. The answer is this is not a group. This is what we would call an aggregation. Why is this? It does not meet all the criteria to be considered a group. So if you'll recall those criteria, they were: it must be composed of 3 or more individuals, they must interact for the achievement of some common goal or goals, and they must influence and be influenced by each other. In this case, the shoppers do meet the first criteria. There are more than 3 individuals. And they might even meet the third criteria in some cases. They might influence each other or be influenced by each other. But they do not meet the second criteria, which is they are not trying to achieve a common goal together. Sure, they all want to purchase goods, but they are not working together to get a product that they will then all share. The same can be said for the plane passengers. They will all board the same plane, most likely, but they are not actively working together to get themselves onto the plane, nor do they likely care whether every one of them manages to get on that plane. How about this one? EOU's Cheer and Dance Squad. I'll give you a minute to think about that. So this is an example of a group. Why is this? It does meet the criteria to be considered a group. It's composed of 3 or more individuals. They are interacting for the achievement of some common goal, which is to entertain the audience at a sporting event in this case. And they influence and are influenced by each other. How do we know this? They obviously rehearsed this cheer or dance together and all agreed to come together at this moment to perform it. What about this one? People waiting in line at a cell phone store. Once again, this is an aggregation for the same reasons as the plane passengers and mall shoppers that were aggregations. Their goals here are individual ones to upgrade or repair their personal phones. Each person probably doesn't care whether the person in front of them or behind them succeeds in their individual goal. Okay, this is a fun one. How about this one? If you are familiar with this show, your first reaction is probably that these individuals are a miserable failure at working together, which is true. But they are still a group, a dysfunctional group, but they are a group nevertheless. Why is this? First of all, they are composed of 3 or more individuals. They interact for the achievement of a common goal or goals, which is to serve the company that they work for. Their goals may vary from day to day and from one episode to the next, but the employees of Michael Scott and Michael Scott himself do have a common goal. And the third criteria that makes them a group, they absolutely influence and are influenced by each other. The relational component is the most entertaining aspect of the show, in my personal opinion. Adding to the complexity of the transactional quality of communication, in groups or otherwise, you can also have intercultural differences. Various world cultures differ in their emphasis as to which is more important, an individual's wants and needs or that of the group. We call this dimension of communication individualism versus collectivism. It is actually a range. No culture is completely individualistic or collectivistic. And not every individual within a culture behaves in ways that are entirely consistent with the dominant tendency of that culture. There goes my cat again. For example, there's a short test you can take which helps you determine what your predominant style is. I have taken this test myself, and I have found that I am actually more collectivistic, although I reside in a culture that is predominantly individualistic. And now you can take this test too. I have provided it for you on Canvas as an extra credit activity. It's quick and fun, and I love stuff like this. In this test, you're provided with a series of scenarios and you are asked to indicate your reaction to that situation. This will help you determine how individualistic or how collectivistic you are. If you have taken a class from me before, you've probably taken this test already, but you should take it again because you might find that its results can actually depend on your mood at the time. You may actually get different results today than you did the previous time you took it. As you might imagine, differences in the individualism versus collectivism dimension of communication can lead to inappropriate and ineffective communication. This map classifies where each country as a whole resides on the spectrum of individualism versus collectivism. The countries in orange rate highest toward the individualistic end of the spectrum, while the countries in blue are more collectivistic. Do you notice any patterns when looking at the map, or does anything surprise you? It is striking to me where the English-speaking countries fall on the spectrum as compared to the Spanish-speaking countries. As you may or may not know, those Spanish-speaking countries were colonized a bit differently than the English-speaking countries were. Spanish settlers, by and large, allowed indigenous cultures which were already there to assimilate. Of course, a lot of those cultures' practices and customs were eradicated, but in many cases, more survived, and traces are still evident in those countries' cultures. This is not to say that individualist cultures are somehow inherently bad or flawed. There actually are a number of problems in cultures which fall at either extreme of the spectrum. Extremely collectivistic cultures are not 100% perfect. One issue that they have is a risk of developing something we call groupthink, which is a tendency for a group or culture to be resistant to positive change simply because people in the group don't want to rock the boat or challenge tradition. There are a number of dimensions, actually, which differentiate the ways that world cultures communicate. One of the ones that appears to be connected to individualism and collectivism is something we refer to as low context versus high context communication. In low context cultures, people's communication is more direct and literal. What is said is what is meant. Countries who utilize low context communication the most are Germany, Scandinavian countries, and the United States. By contrast, in high context cultures, people's communication is less direct and less verbal. Nonverbal communication plays a big role in this type of culture. There are a lot of customary behaviors such as bowing or tipping your hat if you're wearing one, and context is factored in too. For example, those in authority are treated differently than those who don't have formal power. Countries who utilize high context communication the most are Asian cultures. However, like individualism and collectivism, low context and high context communication fall along a spectrum or range. To illustrate this, here is a personal example which surprised me. As you might remember from my welcome video for this course, I used to live in the United Kingdom. My first year there was challenging, and I did not understand why at first. I seemed to be rubbing everyone I met the wrong way, and I had no friends. While England is a more low context culture like the US, it isn't as low context as we are. I knew this going in, but only at a cognitive level. I didn't really understand or appreciate how deep these differences actually are. My British friends and colleagues later told me that they find many Americans abrupt or even rude sometimes. British people as a whole tend to use a lot of niceties in their speech. You've probably heard or know that they are typically and even stereotypically known for their politeness. They hedge their statements a lot. By that I mean they say things like, okay, and here I'm going to do a British accent, so forgive me. Pardon me, but could you perhaps consider, if it's not too much trouble, I don't mean to be rude, but, okay, I probably sounded like C-3PO just then. Okay, in my personal experience, it took a long time for a British person to say anything of substance, but that is just my personal opinion. And remember, on the range of high context and low context communication, the UK is actually closer and therefore more similar to the US in how they communicate. So think about that for a second. Regardless of whether you are from the US or another country, in all our individual interactions with anyone from a foreign culture, imagine just how much our predominant way of communicating impacts every interaction we have with them. This goes a long way toward explaining issues that all countries have with international relations the world over, historically and today. So I will leave you with that thought. I love discussing and considering cultural differences myself. It is one of my favorite aspects of communication studies. That's it for today. If you have general questions about this week's assignments or this class, please let me know through our Q&A discussion forum on Canvas. And if your question is of a more private nature, please email me directly. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today, and I wish you all a great week.